Christian parenting.
Where do you turn when life turns upside down?
Is there hope for the hurting? Can we find joy in the sorrow?
This is the Life Upside Down podcast with Abel Speaks, and we're your hosts, Daniel and Kelly Crawford.
Let's jump into today's episode. We're here again for another episode of the Life Upside Down podcast, and we have got a couple of special humans with us today. Our friends Ryan and Allie Wall. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you guys for having us.
Absolutely, and we could talk extensively for why we're fans of these friends and the ways that the Lord has graciously allowed our stories to intersect in some really sweet and critical seasons. And so for the folks that have no idea what I would be talking about, which is most of them, why don't y'all just tee off, just let us know who you are.
Yeah, so we have been married for about 7 years. We've got a 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old named Everett, who we adopted at birth. And then it's been fun. We know you guys from getting to be in a small group at our church together and spend a season together, and including a hard season for all of us, and so it's been fun to be friends with you guys and community and to sharpen one another. So that's us.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, and a season in which, our season that we shared about in the first episode of walking through our journey of loving and losing our first son, and Ryan and Allie and the many gifts that they have were just a huge provision from the Lord and the body of Christ in action. And so we're pumped to turn the tables on you guys and to get to hear your story and the good and the bad and the ugly and everything in between, and ultimately the ways that we have watched you guys be super faithful for such an extended season. And so I'm excited for the folks listening to get to hear from you.
Thank you.
Yes. So Allie, do you want to start before you guys even met and just share a little bit of your backstory and then how that plays into kind of parts of y'all's story today?
Yes. So really have a great family, grew up in a great home, and went off to college and had a great experience in college. And then after college, found myself in a really hard season of life in my early 20s and making a lot of poor decisions, choosing to surround myself with people that in that season were like-minded in my destruction and path that I was on. And so ultimately ended up in an unplanned pregnancy and opted to abort. And there's a lot in that of at one point not wanting to go through with it, but it was too late. And, it was just a really traumatic experience for me personally. And that really led me into hating myself and questioning if God loved me and all the things that you can imagine you would feel around that. Ultimately, I ended up moving from the Houston area up to Dallas soon after that, and met this handsome man named Ryan, and he fell in love with me super quick.
Naturally.
Makes sense.
No, but Ryan was just different than any guy I had met, and he loved Jesus more than anyone I know, and led with integrity and intentionality. And so when you find a good man, you snag him up and keep him. Anyway, so we ended up getting married. Yeah, hope to start a family, as anyone would hope to do when you get married. So
that's great. What did y'all's first couple years of marriage look like?
Well, it was, I would say, lots of fun and traveling, and it felt like our first year was like a honeymoon the whole time. And so I feel like, I know some couples have a harder first year at navigating what it's like. I mean, I feel like our first year was our best year sometimes, we feel like that. And so that was kind of our first year or two was lots of fun, traveling, laughing, and going out to dinner and just enjoying one another's company. And then about 2 years into marriage or 3 years into marriage was when we adopted Everett, through kind of a crazy circumstances and just kind of an awesome story. I feel like God, not in a way that we could have written or planned on. That's not what we were necessarily looking to do, or not necessarily, we weren't looking to do that. And so we had always been open to the idea of adoption. We had talked about that when we first started dating. But I think that we had a really specific plan of what that looked like. It was probably an uncommunicated plan looking backwards, but I think that we had like a very defined kind of, this is what life is going to look like for us, that we just thought would naturally happen.
Yeah. And in that season, early in marriage, before we knew that infertility would be part of our story, we had some friends of ours walking through infertility. And it's really hard. And now, 5 years in, I can look back and I have so much empathy. But I am grateful that we were able to be up close with another family and watching them navigate a really hard season, because it showed us that we didn't want to allow circumstances outside of our control to take over our marriage. And we didn't want anything to be so all-consuming that it robbed us of any joy. And we did have such a fun marriage. I was grateful that we could witness how that easily can happen, and understandably. And I have so much empathy for that. And I'm grateful that I got to see that example early on, before we were in the throes of it, to go, okay, no, I regardless of how this infertility journey shakes out, like, I don't want to lose my marriage over it.
So you guys had been trying to get pregnant for about a year, and then Everett's adoption came to fruition. And then can you share just a little bit about how that impacted the way that you were viewing trying to have biological children? And was that, did it make it harder, easier, a mix of both? How did you kind of process?
Yeah. So I think that we had, as Allie would say, we had been doing married people things for a year.
Right.
No, we weren't being hyper intentional, paying attention to, hey, are we getting pregnant or not getting pregnant? It was just kind of, we were open to that idea.
Yeah.
And then the opportunity to spend time with Everett's birth mom and eventually adopt Everett happened kind of in the midst of that. And we hadn't even really talked to a doctor or seen anybody. And kind of at the same time, we were just reflecting last week, about the same time that we met Everett's birth mom was the first time that we ever even went to a doctor to say, hey, what is there a reason why we're not getting pregnant? And so we were kind of on those journeys, like really starting at the same time. And then we were excited about the idea of adoption and felt like that's what God was calling us to. And so we didn't really engage in conversations around infertility for probably another year. So we probably had like 6 months of waiting and walking through the adoption process. Then we had 6 months of being new parents and not sleeping and just you're focused on surviving.
Right.
Yeah. And so then it was probably another year later that we were like, hey, we probably should go figure this out. And so then that was kind of the first time that so about 2 years in was the first time that we went to a doctor and started asking questions of like, why are we not, or should we be, is there something different that we need to be doing?
Yeah. And I think that as I look back, subconsciously, you assume that however you become a mom, you're just going to be so grateful that you're a mom. How you became a mom really isn't going to impact you. I don't know if I'm articulating that great, but once I am home and I'm rocking this beautiful child, truthfully, a wave of grief came over me, of empathy for his biological mother. And I wasn't expecting that. And so here I am, and supposed to be the most joyful season that you become a mom, and I'm grieving for someone else. And that was hard. And then, of course, I jump into a new mom group because I didn't have 9 months of pregnancy to plan or think about anything. I didn't even know if I would be a mom. And so I jump into a group at our church called Square One, a new mom group, and I'm the only adopted mom. And I think that was when infertility really for me started to be a wrestle with God of, okay, wait a minute. I'm in a room, and in the big group room, there's like 100 people. Everybody's got crying babies that look just like him, and I think I might be the only adopted mom in the room. And so this numbers game that I feel like the enemy has used a lot in my life of, okay, there's 100 people in this room. You're the only one. Like, has God forgotten you? What, why? And so I think that actual experience fed a wrestle with infertility. And again, you're supposed to be like the sweetest moments with a sweet little newborn. And all of a sudden these things are, surfacing at unexpected times and places that I have to face God with questions. So that was a hard time.
I think it taps into something that's helpful to hear, and then to kind of unwind it. I feel like oftentimes people, especially people that care for us and love us, there's a desire. I mean, they want to see us happy and joyful, especially in seasons where there's been a struggle. And so that can kind of result in almost kind of a desperate sprint towards a silver lining in terms of, okay, so what is the little blessing in here that makes, ties a bow on this whole thing, and so that we can, get out of sad and back into happy. And so what I think I hear you saying, and you can speak to it maybe further, is Everett is all of those things. He is a tremendous blessing who you could probably say, who knows, maybe wouldn't have entered into our story in that same way, given different circumstances, on our end and from a family planning standpoint. But the presence of a beautiful little boy doesn't negate the reality of the ongoing infertility. And so I don't know if I said that super clearly, but
yes, I love that. And it reminds me too of, I mentioned at the beginning, just my abortion, and that was part of what led us to being able to adopt our son, was because his birth mom, was abortion minded and chose not to. And so just like, I know if Abel Speaks, you guys get the opportunity to see Abel's life have meaning and purpose and continue on his legacy by helping all these families and continuing in the same way I felt like, for me to share my journey and my unborn child life, for his life to have purpose and meaning, even though it wasn't outside of the womb, is like the greatest honor of my life because I'm so unworthy. It's like and so for now to have Everett and know like learning in infertility, like the chance of you getting pregnant is so tiny. Like it's crazy. I don't think people realize that, but it is like a half a second on a certain day of a month at a certain time. But all the stars align. It's crazy. And so I can look at our sweet son's life and know that, God has such purpose and plan. And what you were saying with I could not love my son more. I mean, I think he is the greatest kid on the planet. No offense, but he really he's everything I could have dreamed of. And yet I learned from you guys something that will forever stick with me, of just this idea that you can have different emotions at the same time. So I was experiencing a ton of joy and excitement, and at the same time also a sadness and a realization, and that those things can intermingle, and that that's okay. And it doesn't take away from either side.
Yeah, I think the tension to your question is like, I think that there's a healthiness to looking for where God is at work. I think you said kind of silver line. I do think that there's a healthiness to understanding what God might be doing for our good. At the same time, we see dimly now, and someday we're going to see clearly. And there's this proverb of like, it's to the glory of a man to search out what's going on with the king, and it's foolish for him to search too hard. And so I think it's the same tension that I feel of like, hey, we should have a high view of God where we're like, what are you doing? Like, there's got to be something that you're doing that's for our good. At the same time, we shouldn't exhaust ourselves trying to totally understand God's sovereignty, because it can become frustrating when we don't clearly see the good that God is doing in the midst of something. And so we have to trust that good is happening while not seeing it and not driving ourselves crazy trying to explain.
Not from experience.
Where we can try to get really creative in trying to explain what God's up to. So I think that there's a tension of like, how much do we lean into that and not, and there's not a perfect answer to that.
I think it too, if we were God, Abel would still like be here, and there is a tension in sitting in that, but also seeing like the Lord use our son's life to help us know our Creator more. So those two things are not at odds with each other, but there's tension there, right? And so I think sitting in that and just saying like that, the fact that we know God more is like such a gift, and we can call that good, but in the same breath, if we could change it, we would, and so I think there's like this, it doesn't have to be this like wrapped in a bow silver lining, but there is still elements of like good, but still don't see the full picture, and we won't until we are face to face with the Lord. But something you said, Allie, about like the moms group, which I went through the same one, and it was really hard for me too, for, similar but different reasons. But I just felt like my experience was so different than the other moms in that room that it was really hard for me to like connect and relate. And I think in a lot of ways it felt almost like isolating. So I don't know if you've experienced that in other ways, Ryan, too, but is that something you guys can just speak to of like, has this journey felt isolating, and how have you guys combated that, I guess?
Yes. Yes. The new mom group, the isolation began both in the sense of having not birthed my child and feeling like I couldn't connect to other moms. I was fully connecting with my child, to make clear, but to other moms. And then I think that continued. I actually don't know if y'all remember, but I did a workout group with you guys, like very soon after. And everyone got pregnant. And I was the only person in the group that could have gotten, that was married, other people could have gotten pregnant too.
On purpose.
You know what I mean? And so that was soon after, I think, in that same season. And I was like, oh, I'm the only one again, and then, our son had a lot of eating difficulties in the beginning of his life. And so just being in a social setting was really hard because he might vomit everywhere. And so I again felt isolated of just like, why me? Like, I just want to be normal, right? Like that. Yes. I'm not even asking for great. Right. I just be normal. And, that has definitely led, like, there's been other groups that I've been a part of, and I'm the only, in my community group, two families have 3 kids and one has 2. And so I'm the only one that's never experienced that pregnancy, that delivery. And so I do think that's the enemy's playground. And I think that while circumstances are true, that in a lot of scenarios I can feel like the only one, I can allow the enemy to use that to question God and feel like he's forgotten me, or people that have had abortions before, and walking through that with a lot of women, post-abortive women, you maybe can feel like God is punishing you if you struggle to then get pregnant, or you may question, like, did something happen in that procedure that now is keeping me from getting pregnant, or will that be the only chance I had at pregnancy? And so I know I'm gearing a little off of that specific isolating question, but I think in all those places, hey, the enemy can quickly have me spiraling into dark places. And ultimately, I have to come back to, like, I know he's faithful and he hasn't forgotten me. And my child that I'm holding is evidence of that. And so all that, as I'm externally processing, I think is to say, like, I think we probably all in moments of our life feel forgotten or feel like we're the only one.
Yep.
And I would say I'm so sorry, because I fully have felt that. And then also, God hasn't forgotten, and he's doing something, and that can feel frustrating at times, and that's okay. So, and declare, and he isn't punishing us for past action that isn't in God's character.
I love what you said in terms of just that space, that mental headspace being the devil's playground. And those are two of the leading questions probably, you know. Has God forgotten me? Like, does he care? Does he see me? Has he abandoned me? And is God punishing me? You know, is there something about my present unpleasant circumstances or undesirable, whatever, me being where I don't wish to be right now, that connects back to me blowing it somehow in the past or making a bad decision, and what goes around comes around, and you know, almost like an idea of karma, which is a prevalent spiritual religious outlook, is that idea of everything is connected. And so what I love, you know, and what I hear you fighting to rest in, is that idea of, thankfully that's not what the gospel teaches, you know, that it teaches this God of grace, you know, who bestows things on us that we don't deserve. He gives us good gifts that we don't deserve, and he's a God of mercy. You know, he refrains from giving us bad things that we do deserve. Just him being a God of grace and mercy. And then also even thinking of just like within the scriptures that speak from beginning to end about this topic of suffering and sorrow and the world being less than it was designed to be. I think of Job, the whole book. And those are two of like the fundamental questions. I don't think his buddies frame it just like that, but that's kind of their theology too, is, well, if you don't like what you got, it's either, you know, because, you know, you've done something to deserve this, or because God's cursing you and punishing you, or whatever it is. And so I love that the scriptures, which a lot of biblical scholars think that's one of the, if not the first book really captured and recorded in the scriptures. And so I love the fact that just fundamentally and foundationally God's word makes a stand, you know, against those thoughts. It doesn't mean, you know, that the thoughts aren't going to still creep in, but I love that we can go back to God's word and the scriptures.
Yeah, I think I was just reading, and I think that he makes a point that the opposite is true in 1 Peter 4. That it's basically like that we're all going to suffer, and then we're going to suffer as we continue to mature and follow Christ. Then it's like it's coming, like and even more so. Right. Like I remember being overseas in the Middle East, and one of the guys, I think in Jordan, said, you know, they believe in two types of blessings: the blessing of salvation and the blessing of suffering, which is just a crazy theology in the U.S. Like that's not something that we don't consider that a blessing, but it was a blessing that he considered that was part of their maturing process as Christians, was like that we will, like God says that we're going to suffer, and increasingly more so as we see that day coming, you know. And so
I like what you said about the blessing of suffering, because what we have experienced and get to see in people's lives on a daily basis is just this, in like God's mysterious, weird way, you know, he like uses the people that have walked the hardest things are the people that we see who like know him the best. And I think it's like a sweet thing to see that in this weird way we can relate to Christ as we suffer and can relate to him in his sufferings too. And so I think there is like I haven't ever heard it like worded that way, but I think it would behoove us, you know, as a society really to change our perspective and to really see like, man, we would never choose suffering because that's not our human instinct, right? But that so much bitter sweetness, but still sweetness comes from walking through some of the hardest seasons of our lives. And so I love that perspective.
Yeah.
Well, I think James just talks about how that suffering is what produces perseverance, which produces character, which that's where our like hope comes from, and so like you can just see that tension of people who've been through hard things have a hope that you're like, how? And and God's clear, like that's where it's through all of those trials that are like rootedness in Christ grows deeper and more firm.
Yeah, I think the hope ultimately rooted in not even anything this world has to offer, but in the life to come and in the new heavens and the new earth. But that, even as a preview and a foretaste of the hope that we have and the redemption that is coming, that God has promised, it does give it reframes our view of reality to where we do have, we can walk through life still with a sense of hope in the midst of really difficult circumstances.
This season that you guys have walked through in the last 5 years, there's kind of a season within that, which is related to your mom getting cancer and then passing away. So do you want to speak to that, share how you guys have navigated that and the hopes and prayers that you guys prayed in that season that didn't come to fruition in the way that you had asked and begged the Lord for?
Yeah. So and the journey that we're on, we're 5 years into trying to get pregnant. And by all accounts, from talking with doctors, they think that we should. So we still have this like very hopeful that next month or sometime soon that we'll be pregnant.
Ryan is very hopeful.
So in the midst of that, there are little like milestones along the way. You realize that something that you had hope for doesn't come true, and so big picture, we're like very hopeful, or I'm very hopeful that we can still get pregnant. But with my mom passing away a year and a half ago, then one of those things was like, hey, we're hopeful that we'll like get pregnant that Christmas season that my mom was still with us and we'll get to share that with her. And so there are these small things that I think that we both felt that I don't even know that we communicated to one another. But then when that didn't happen, we grieved of like, we can't wait to go share this with my mom. And so I think that those missed opportunities in the future are things that are like hard to explain of like what grief looks like, And so in that, like, I don't feel sad for my mom not getting to meet hopefully our next kid, or I don't feel sad for my mom not getting to be at our son's graduation. I feel sad for our son. I feel sad for our future like hopeful kid that they don't get to know my mom. My mom's with Jesus. She's doing awesome right now. There's nothing. My mom is not sad today. Right. I'm the one who's sad. My mom's not sad. And so I think that there's a component that is like, hey, there's missed opportunities, there, and who knows what that other, with each kind of day, then it can feel like, hey, there's another missed opportunity.
Yeah. And I think that season when, my mother-in-law passed, I just went into depression and had PTSD things from my abortion, like just around death, like anything around death, like really came back to me like really heavy. And I was in a dark place, and honestly, the toughest place in my walk with the Lord, and this wrestle with God of, here I feel like, yes, I was really jacked up, in a season of my life, but now I feel like I've been on a straight and narrow. Like, I'm serving at the church and working at the church, and we're loving Jesus and we're pouring out, and God, like, why don't you throw me a bone? Like, I'm being faithful, and I'm doing all the right things, and I'm not rushing, to do medical treatments that, doctors and other people may encourage us to do. It's like, hey, I'm trying to trust you. I'm trying to do this the right way. And like, why don't you just throw us this bone? Like, why would you not let us get pregnant before his mom passes? Like, to experience that together. And so that is when I'm grateful. The realization in my time with God that my faith isn't marked by seasons of wrestling. The fact that I was still turning to God and questioning to him, even yelling at him or arguing with him, I was still going to him. and that it was okay to like not be okay. And that didn't mean I was less of a Christian, or that like I just needed to pray more, or and I've done that to people. Like when people have struggled, I've been like, well, are you in the word, and are you praying, and well, here's a verse, and it's like all these band-aids. And at the end of the day, as we look at scripture, there's so much wrestling, and there's so much heartache, and people are imperfect, and God is faithful, and that all of these things can coexist. But that did lead to a season of saying no to a lot of things, and that was okay. And so saying no to baby showers and, different celebrations and things like that. And that was really hard. I'm a 2 Enneagram. I want to go party.
Yeah.
But a season of prioritizing, my walk with Jesus and in my home, that I really needed for our home to be a good place and good for our son. And, that was more important than a baby shower. I'd still celebrate friends one-on-one, but to know that sometimes boundaries are really good, and God gives us boundaries. And that can be a good thing.
I think it's really good too, just because, it depends on the personality type, but I think for a lot of people, when they're walking through really hard seasons, can really struggle with feeling selfish, or like we're not doing enough, or if I can't run at the same capacity that I have in other seasons of my life, I think they can, we can feel bad or guilty or whatever that is. And I think that there is such freedom and like wisdom a lot of times, just to say, hey, this is to acknowledge like where we're at, and to make sure that we are doing things that are protecting our heart and mind. And then as an extension of that, if we are married and have children, to be protecting our home and making sure that they're our first priority. And sometimes that's all we have to give, we don't have enough to be doing all the things for all the people. And I think that feeling the freedom to say no is a really hard place for people to like get to. And so I love that you like shared that.
Okay, so right as we were fixing to land the plane on this interview with Ryan and Allie, something kind of awesome happened. We suddenly found ourselves really neck deep in a totally different conversation than we had set out to have. And so I'm going to play this like Hollywood and just leave it at that as a cliffhanger for now. But you will want to tune back in next week as we keep it flowing with Ryan and Allie Wall. Be there or be square.
This has been the Life Upside Down podcast, powered by Christian Parenting.
Our vision is that every parent and every person might experience hope and joy even in the midst of sorrow. If you found today's content helpful, we'd invite you to pass it along to a friend who might be encouraged as well.
You can find us at christianparenting.org/lifeupsidedown, and we hope you'll continue the journey with us in the weeks to come.
We'd also invite you to check out ablespeaks.org to learn more about the mission we've given our lives to. We'll see you next time.